You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. Hello, and welcome to this solo episode of Economics Detective Radio. It's me, your host, Garrett Petersen, and I'm going to be talking about some of my own research today. Recently, me and three co-authors got some good news. We got our paper conditionally accepted at the Journal of the Economic Science Association, JESA for short. And this paper is something we've been working on for a long time. It, went through revise and resubmit, and, before that, went through a couple iterations just to get to the point of being able to submit it, which is all par for the course for academic research. Of course, these things take a lot of time. You sometimes see, a working paper that doesn't get published for like 12 years or some ungodly amount of time. But so it's a long time this paper took a long time to get to this point in terms of like normal conceptions of time and how long things take. But compared to, when you compare to the glacial rate of academia, it's actually quite quick. So let's talk about the paper. The paper is called Instructions. It's co-authored by Dave Freeman, Eric Kimbrough, myself, and Tong. So alphabetical authorship, if you're keeping track. It started out as a different project by Dave and Eric. They were both professors at Simon Fraser University, at least at the time. Eric since moved to Chapman University. But this was a project to study memory originally. Now, I told you the title is Instructions, but I'll get to that, it being a paper about instructions later. But it started out as a study on memory, and the idea was that they were going to test how sophisticated people were about their forgetfulness. So in other words, an unsophisticated person is forgetful, but does not anticipate that they'll be forgetful. So they think that they will remember in the future, and then they forget, and they get a bad outcome. A sophisticated person might be forgetful, but they know they're going to be forgetful, and so they'll take preemptive action anticipating their own forgetfulness. And of course, then there's a person who's not forgetful, which, of course, this whole concept of sophistication requires you to be forgetful at least some of the time, because if you're just never forgetful, then of course you can't be sophisticated about it. You don't need to be. You just remember stuff and anticipate yourself remembering stuff. So Dave and Eric came up with a test of sophistication in memory, and it went like this. So you had a game that you would play. It was called the Poodle Jump, and the working title of this paper, what we all called it while we were working on it, was Poodle Jump. So you play this game where it's based on Doodle Jump, which is a popular mobile game, but you just, you have a bouncing poodle that bounces from platform to platform. And, you can get some small amount of money for each minute of playing this Poodle Jump game. And this was just a way to sort of distract people, and give them something to do for a half hour or so. Because, of course, in a memory study, you need time for a person to, to be able to forget something, have a lapse in memory. So it had to fill that time somehow. If they were just staring at a blank wall, I doubt anyone would forget anything. If all you have to do is remember this one thing. So we had people in a lab playing the Poodle Jump game, and we informed them that, we taught them how to play another task, which was the slider task, which is used in several different experiments, but it's just, you have 4 sliders. It's just a little button that you can move along a track, and you have to move all sliders to 50. They go from 0 to 100, so you have to precisely place them on the 50 mark and hit continue. And that's the slider task. So quite boring compared to the Poodle Jump, which is kind of a fun little game. So we have people playing this Poodle Jump game, and the Poodle Jump game is worth 25 cents per minute. The slider task, which they can only do once, is worth 20 cents for the first 21 minutes, and then it's worth $7 in minute 22, and then it falls off after that. So 7, then it goes down to 5, and then 4.50, and then 4, and down until it's nothing. And that takes up the full half hour. So think about yourself doing this experiment. You can only do the slider task once. When do you decide to do the slider task? Now, if you can correctly remember this for 22 full minutes, you're going to want to do the slider task in minute 22. And in fact, you're going to want to do that no matter what, because doing it early just loses you 5 cents. It's no value in that. So you're sitting doing the Poodle Jump, you wait 22 minutes, you do the slider task, you end up with, I think, around $21. Then there's another version. And so all this treatment would do is just figure out what baseline percentage of people are forgetful. So, what percentage of people will just forget to hit the button altogether and forget to do the slider task and miss out on $7 and earn 14 just doing the Poodle Jump instead because they forgot. The other treatment in this memory study is the same, except for the first 21 rounds, you can get $5 for doing the slider task. So if you can wait 22 minutes to do the slider task, to hit the button and do it, you can earn $7 plus all the money you made during the Poodle Jump, so that's 21. But if you just hit the button right away, do the slider task first thing when you know you won't forget, then you can earn $5 plus what you earn doing the Poodle Jump, which I believe comes to about $19. So, almost as much, almost as good, doesn't require you to remember anything. And the hypothesis was that some percentage of forgetful people would hit the button right away. Non-forgetful people would hit the button at the 22-minute mark. And unsophisticated forgetful people would not hit the button at all. They'd forget entirely, or, they'd wait too long, realized it's been 24 minutes. I'm 2 minutes behind, and then hit it as soon as they remembered. And so that's kind of a neat study and a neat idea, right? Sophistication in forgetfulness. What proportion of people who are forgetful are sophisticated about it? But the problem was, so we did the $5 study first, right? And about a third of people hit the button right away, which was kind of neat. Okay, so that's consistent. Like, those people, a third of people are sophisticated, forgetful people. And then, so we tested it with the low treatment, the treatment where there was no benefit to hitting the button early. And that's where things broke down, because a third of people still hit the button right away. So a third of people, just to get this straight, would mash a button right now to lose 5 cents when waiting 22 minutes to hitting that button would gain them $7. And this confused the heck out of us, because, it just, at first we were like, some percentage of people are sophisticated, as that's the hypothesis we're testing. And then we do the control group, where there's no opportunity to be sophisticated, and they mash that button right away, which just completely messed up the study. So that is when we pivoted to doing something else. So when we noticed that people apparently were not understanding things, we started by giving them a quiz. So after the instructions were done, we'd give them a quiz just to test what they did and didn't understand. And the funny thing is, when we gave the quiz but didn't give any answers to the quiz, people did even worse. And then we started doing the quiz, but then reading out the correct answers to people so that, you could reinforce that, and they did somewhat better. We did the quiz and gave the answers and also paid people 25 cents for each correct answer they got on the quiz, paid people to understand things. They didn't do any better than just quiz with answers on that. They just, they still did better than the baseline, but they didn't do even better, which we were expecting them to do better in that case, because, we had paid them for understanding, so we expected more of it because we're economists and we believe in incentives. But apparently not in this case. And then we also tried one additional treatment. Actually, I think that one may have come after the first round of the first revise and resubmit. But we did later do another treatment where we gave them a set of paper instructions, and then they could have those instructions in front of them and read from them while they were doing the quiz and while they were completing the experiment, which, of course, in our original experiment, they only had the instructions on the screen, which they didn't have an opportunity to look back at. Because, of course, in the original design, when it's about memory, reminding people of the rules defeats the purpose of a memory study. But at this point, we pivoted to making it a study about how instructions are delivered in experimental procedures. So we went meta because our original study failed because people didn't understand the instructions. And it's actually kind of fortunate for us because, shockingly, the field of experimental economics has been around for decades. And except for a few isolated little papers about really specific topics, there hasn't really been a very general study of instructions and how they're delivered. We've all just kind of, we've got our norms and we deliver instructions how we deliver instructions. And then often we, some experimenters test to see, give checks of understanding, give a quiz, and maybe look at how many people give completely irrational answers to their, when they're strictly dominated strategies like mashing that button right away in our study. They'll give that as a measure of like how many people just fully didn't understand. But often we just kind of presume that people understand our instructions and that misunderstanding just kind of generates noise. But the field needed a paper like this to just look at how people are giving instructions, what works, what doesn't. And I acknowledge that this applies particularly to our own particular design. And there have been a couple other studies looking at, say, giving a very specific kind of study, varying the instructions. I think there's one on like Corno competition experiments where, okay, what happens if we explain it in math versus explaining it with pictures, but nothing very general. So the other thing we did, so we have our experiment itself, and we showed that giving a quiz and then giving answers to it for reinforcement, or giving paper instructions that people could then review when they were doing the quiz, those both helped. Those both greatly, we brought down our misunderstanding from like a third of people misunderstanding to closer to a fifth, but still shockingly high. still pretty bad. Like, there were, no matter what we threw at people, there's no treatment where everyone got it right. Oh, we also did one treatment where the instructions were just delivered twice. People did a round of the instructions, and then I turned off the experiment, turned it back on, and had them go through it again. And the funny thing about that treatment is that it actually started with a computer freezing on us and me having to redo it. And then we kind of thought, well, hey, let's just do that happened in a really big session. So we already had, like 20 people in that treatment just when it happened by mistake. And so we did it a couple more times, brought that up to the same sample size as our other treatments, and that became one of our successful treatments. Giving the instructions twice was one of the more successful ways of getting people to understand, but again, with some level of misunderstanding still happening. So in addition, we decided that we were going to make this a more general study about instructions, and we were going to show how it was relevant to the current practices in experimental economics. So what we did also is a meta-analysis where Han and I, the two grad students working on this paper, went through every lab experiment paper in 5 top journals over a course of 5 years. And we just, we had a spreadsheet, and we read through each of these papers, and we just coded whether or not they, what kind of instructions they gave, what format. Was it on a computer? Was it on paper? Did it use both? And, or was it presented orally by the person running the experiment? We coded 260 papers for that, and found that that the most common form for delivering instructions was on paper. 124 of our 260 experiments were paper-only instructions, and 11 were both computer and paper, and actually 56 were unclear. So that's an issue we had. Even reading all of these papers and going through their supplemental material, researchers don't always make it clear exactly what form their instructions are in, which is, given that we've shown that the form of instructions have an impact on how well people understand and, their performance in experiments. For the sake of replication, it's probably best to be clear about that. So we make that point to researchers that you got to be clear about exactly how you're running your lab and how you're presenting the information to subjects. But yeah, in fact, there were more papers that were unclear about how they delivered their instructions than there were doing computer only. So 56 unclear and 48 computer only, and 21 neither, actually. So that would be cases where, it's like a lab in the field experiment or a really simple experiment, and the experimenter just explains it in words and doesn't give you paper or a computer screen. So the other aspect of our meta-analysis was to look for the kind of things that we had been testing. So is there a quiz? Is there additional reinforcement? Is the quiz incentivized? Do they give a quiz followed by the answers to that quiz? And so we looked at all of those in addition, and just counted of the 260 papers which ones said what in our which ones gave which forms of reinforcement, and what was the norm in that case. We also coded, what kind of experiment it was. Was it a one-shot kind of thing? So our experiment, even though the students are in the lab for a whole half hour, it was a one-shot game. You could press that button one time and that was it. That was, you had either pressed it too early or pressed it on time, and that was our one test, right? So for a one-shot experiment, it's really important that people understand, and especially for an experiment on memory, you can't repeat it 50 times because then you're reinforcing people's memories. Memory and learning in studies are problematic that way. So we looked at the types of studies that were one shot. You just do something one time and you don't get really feedback between decisions, and then the other ones where you did get feedback between decisions. So you can imagine, a game that you play 20 times over and over again, and each time, you get to see how it works out. In that kind of experiment, even if people don't understand your instructions right away, they're going to learn, after the first couple times. And so a lot of experiments will have a practice round, or they'll drop the first couple rounds from their data because those are the time when people are learning. Yeah, and we found that that there were some differences in the way that people delivered instructions depending on whether they were one shot or multi-round experiment. But yeah, we went through all of these, and there was really quite a lot of interesting things. But the main takeaway is that there are just a lot of different ways that people give instructions and reinforce them. And so the profession hasn't really converged on one set of best practices, although there are some patterns, like giving paper instructions. That's a pretty common thing. And oddly enough, in the one-shot experiments, they tended to have less practice rounds and demonstration than the ones with feedback between decisions. And I think the issue there is that sometimes you just can't practice a decision, right? If it's just a prisoner's dilemma, you got two choices. Like, how much practice can you really do? Whereas if you're doing like a 20-round market study, you can totally, do a practice round. And so I think we were picking up that. So although, we would hypothesize that a one-shot game has more to fear from misunderstandings because there's no learning during the experiment, the way things worked out, there was more practice in those kinds of games with feedback, just because of the nature of the games. And that was the main difference we found, that was statistically significant. So we submitted this to JESA a while back, and when we got the revise and resubmit, they asked us to run some more treatments. In particular, there were some aspects of our instructions that where like, oh, what if you change this word here? Just little things just to, clarify the wording. And we ran into difficulties because we were really scraping to the bottom of our subject pool, trying to get that last bit of sample size. Like, I ran so many experiments where only like 2 or 3 people showed up. And also the word was starting to spread about what to do exactly when you join this experiment, because a lot of the time people do our experiment, they get some money, they tell their friends, oh, go do that experiment, and here's how you get the money, right? And so it kind of started to be a problem in these later treatments. I'm not sure how much of an impact that had, but so we did our enhanced instructions, and there was less misunderstanding in that treatment as well. But, once again, there's still 20% of people mashing that button right away, misunderstanding the experiment. And so I think my main takeaway from this is that people don't always read things super clearly. I want to draw an analogy to games. So in video games and board games, they face the problem of trying to teach people how to play the game. And that's what we're doing too. It's just, a different kind of game. It's not meant to be fun. It's meant to tell us, the researchers, something interesting about how you make decisions. But still, people are used to these video games that are extremely user-friendly. Like, in the 80s, you'd play a video game, you'd turn on a video game that showed you like a wall of statistics, or, they had these war games, right, from the early days, where it was just like completely difficult to fathom, right? And they had come out of earlier board games that were just so complex and detailed. And, they wanted you to read a bunch of stuff to understand what was going on, and people didn't like those games. So, they moved on to games that, you don't have to read a bunch of instructions before you can play them. You just start playing, and then they teach you as you go. sometimes it's with an explicit tutorial, like, you click on something and it says, this thing does this, or, hey, try clicking here, and then this will happen, and, giving you on-screen sort of prompts. Or some games, they get you to figure it out. They if the game has 10 different mechanics, it'll start with just one, how to walk in a straight line, right? And now how to turn, and now how to jump, right? And they'll teach them to you one at a time and get you to learn as you do. And for our experiment, people couldn't do that. They had to read, and they had to read carefully, and they had to read several paragraphs of text. And we mentioned multiple times that you could only hit that button once. And that was where people had their biggest misunderstanding. It wasn't that they thought that you could earn more money by hitting the button right away. It's that they thought, I can hit this button as many times as I want, so I'm going to... And then what they did typically is, I watched one person jot down in front of them 22, like when they read, okay, 22 is the period where I can make the most money. And then watch that same person hit the button in period 1. And I think what it was is that they were trying to test the system, right? Okay, let's just make sure that this button works. Let's make sure that I can go to this other task. And, without strong feedback saying, hey, you can only do this once, they would just tried it out. Okay, let's make sure this still works. Okay, it still works. And then they were frustrated when 21 minutes later, the button didn't work anymore. And people would ask me hey, why isn't this working? And I'd say, well, you can only do it once. I honestly, I'm happy about where the study went, because I think we got a really interesting result, just telling us about when people do and don't understand instructions, especially when, the relevant bit is buried in several paragraphs of text and people might not read particularly closely. And among the people who did our quiz all correctly, they tended to not have misunderstanding in the actual test, although a couple of them did, I think. One or two, but I'm not sure about that. But barely any, if any at all. But yeah, people are testing the software. They expect to be able to learn while doing. And honestly, I think the previous memory study would have succeeded if, when you wanted to activate the slider task, the task that paid more if you were able to wait 21 minutes, then if it had just shown a prompt saying, are you sure you can only do this once, there during the experiment and not before, then the original memory study would have worked. Although, among people who fully understood the instructions, almost no one forgot. So, hard to test sophistication in the face of forgetfulness when 22 minutes apparently is just not long enough for people to forget something. Apparently, memory lapses take longer than that to occur. But yeah, I guess if I'm giving a message to experimental economists, that message is make your experiment more user-friendly. Give prompts and reminders during the experiment. Use plain language. Make sure to draw attention to the parts that are important. Beta test your software with people and see what they misunderstand. It's hard because, often we test with other economists, and other economists understand, this kind of thing, particularly other experimentalists. They've seen 1,000 studies like this, so of course they understand. But you have to account for people not giving you their full attention, or just missing things, or just being dumb. One of our referees had a line saying, maybe participants in Vancouver are just, stupid, which is actually in the referee report. So I don't think so. I don't think they're particularly stupid. I think in a lot of the studies we reviewed, the researchers just didn't have the information that they would need to know if people were just wildly misunderstanding their experiment. And so might have inferred like, oh, these people make these kind of choices for this reason, and when the real reason is just pure confusion. And it's hard to account for that in a study. I mean, a lot of them are simple, and so hopefully you have less misunderstanding there. I hope there's going to be more research in this area. Maybe someone will run a different kind of experiment with the potential for misunderstanding and show how instructions can be delivered in a way that get people to understand. I'm not sure there's a good way to generalize this. Make an experiment that sort of represents understanding, or that if people can understand this, then they can understand any of our experiments, because that's what we really want to get at. We want general insights for all of experimental economics. And if your experiment is really, really different from this one, maybe you walk away from this thinking, well, it doesn't apply to me. It probably does. It probably does apply to your experiment. If your experiment has more than one choice, more than a couple, if it has any level of complexity, you're going to have to deal with this problem. But yeah, I mean, I hope in the future we're able to do a better job showing people how to participate in our experiments and getting them to really understand the connection between their choices and their payoffs. Because, when we do our theoretical models showing like, okay, this kind of behavior corresponds to this model in this way, or, we have our theories, often they don't account for pure misunderstanding. That paper now soon to be forthcoming at, unless something goes catastrophically wrong, soon to be forthcoming at the Journal of the Economic Science Association. It's titled Instructions, which, by the way, pretty cool to get a one-word title in. Not a lot of one-word titles. I believe there's a Charnas paper called Participation. Actually, I know there is, because it's one of the 260 papers we reviewed in our lit review. By the way, that was just, that lit review took months and months of my time. So we went through it multiple times as we did different revisions, and we had to do it individually and then reconcile. The two coders reconciled with each other, talk through all our disagreements and came with a, final thing. And each paper, sometimes the information's not just there on the front page. You have to dig through the supplementary material to find it. It was very difficult. So if you're ever writing an experimental paper and you want to review what the standard practice is for instructions or for any of the things we looked at, don't do that yourself. Just go over to our paper and find the right line in the table, the thing you're looking at, and say, oh, as is standard practice, we gave our instructions in paper form, and you can just refer to our lit review to confirm that is indeed the standard practice. Or you could, I suppose you could just say that, and most people would not doubt you, but if you need some quantitative evidence to show that, we've got it. So that paper is coming out soon. If you want to read the working paper version, it's also available on SSRN. So Freeman et al. Instructions, published in 2018, unless something goes wrong. I'll be back with a new episode for you, hopefully next week. Thanks for listening. And I really appreciate you listening to this podcast and giving your support. Hope to be in your earbuds again soon. Thanks.